Well, Dave, good to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Before we begin, just tell us a little bit about, I'll introduce you a little bit out in front, but just tell us a little bit about what you do today.
Sure. So I am the director of training for an organization called Faith in Action, and we are a faith-based community organizing group. And all that means is that we work with people of faith, primarily inside of congregations, who are looking out at their community and they are wanting to see some changes. It could be that they want to improve the quality of their neighborhoods. It could be that they want to engage the police in a more meaningful way in terms of how police engage the neighborhoods. It could be that it's a neighborhood full of immigrants and they aren't satisfied with how immigrants are being treated. And so our role is to work with those folks to help them organize new solutions and different solutions in which the folks who are inside those communities are at the center of the solutions. We believe very much that folks are the authors of their own liberation, and it's a joy that we're working with people of faith who understand that that it is their God and their Creator who compels them to make change and build the beloved community.
Amen, amen. And that's what I love. That's what I hear. Right? Is bringing the church and the community together. Right?
Absolutely.
And building this. And so, as you know, we are in our second week of living into the beloved community.
Yeah.
And you know, today we are looking at the past. Right? So we opened up with reading an overview of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham
Sure.
jail. That's why as a community, why the church, why we can't be silent. And Reverend Bob opened us up, and Eric gave us a kind of a little history lesson on just not only America, but also here in Kansas City.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about this word racism, right, that's going on. And tell us why it is important to talk about racism today, especially when it involves the church, this community, as we continue to move forward.
Yeah, so I'd like to answer that in two ways, if you don't mind. So the first answer to the question about why it's important, I think it's important because as Christians, we begin with this understanding that God looks over creation and he says it's good. And then we hear in chapter 2 of Genesis, not only does God look over creation and say it's good, then what God does is say that God makes us in God's image. And so if creation is good and if we are made in God's image, the question as people of God is, do we reflect that? And the reality is that what racism does is it diminishes the image of God in us. And so part of what's compelling me as someone who's Cambodian, who has been generally and lovingly accepted in this country, I also understand that there are moments when that image of God is diminished in me. And sometimes it's from folks who aren't people of faith, and sometimes it's from folks who are people of faith. And I think that what God is asking us to do is to say there's a better way, and God is calling us to something better. The second way I'd like to address your question, though, is to understand that when we talk about racism, we understand racism monolithically. And so in the trainings that I do with folks around the issue of race, is I talk about racism in 4 dimensions, right? One dimension is interpersonal. It's the acts that I might do to you or you might do to me. That's the racism that we talk about all the time. It's something that someone does to another person. But there are 3 other dimensions. There's an intrapersonal dimension, right? So interpersonal, between and among, intrapersonal, within. That's when, like, what happens as a person of color is sometimes I internalize the images of race about myself, whether it comes to intelligence or beauty. Like, I internalize a set of messages about what it means to be a person of color. Then there are 2 other dimensions that are really important. Institutional racism. Racism that exists inside of institutions. And so with the protests around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, that's about looking at the racism that exists within law enforcement and within the police, the institution of the police in our communities, right? So when we look at the fact that Black people are stopped at a higher rate than what is represented in their community, oftentimes even at a higher rate than white folks, when we look at the fact that Black folks are killed at a higher rate, like, that's institutional racism. It exists within institutions. We may want to go here later, but we have to examine the history inside the church and how that may have been manifested in the church. Then there's a fourth dimension that we talk about. That's structural racism. And structural racism means that it's built and dependent upon history and laws. So the important thing with Bob Hill and Eric, the historian Eric Stafford, is that they're talking about, like, we have to understand the history that codified a set of things, laws and policies, and put them in place. And that is embedded in the structures that we live in. So just a real quick example around that is when we look at why Kansas City might be so segregated, it's not segregated by accident, right? Is that when the Kansas City was developed by someone named J.C. Nichols, who's a brilliant developer, he also, what he did was when he created neighborhoods and homes and he sold them, he put inside the deeds of those homes, right? So it doesn't matter if you were a well-intentioned person and you wanted to sell your home to a person of color. Inside the deed of that home, we call those racial covenants, he said, you can't sell this home to a black, a Jew, Chinese, or a Mexican. Those are the words. That's codified inside the deed of the home, and that was in particular neighborhoods. So when we have a stratified neighborhood in Kansas City, that's not accidental. That was built into the structures and the laws that existed at that time. One final piece about that, or about this, is to say that when we talk about racism, you may be talking to me about interpersonal, the thing that I did to someone else. And you might say, you know what, I'm good. I don't do this to anyone. Like, I don't say those words. I don't make those jokes. I don't do those things. And I, as a person of color, might be saying, but there is a structural and institutional component that we have to address, and we're talking past each other. Yeah. And I think what's important for us to do is first be clear about what do we mean by racism? Like, what dimension are we talking about? And when we look to make solutions, we've done better, right? Mm-hmm. We have done better around interpersonal racism. But the question is, do we as people of faith, and do we as God's people of faith, are we addressing the structural components which continue to keep us apart?
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a lot, but let me just kind of break this down. You know, just because as a personal experience, right? You know, I'm a pastor, right, and I've had this said to me numerous times, right? That Pastor Tino, you know, I don't see you as a brown pastor. I see you as a child of God. You know, we talked about that just now, right? The Imago Dei, the image of that we carry, the divine image that we carry. But at the same time, though, I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. Like, you know, yes, we are created in this image of God. We are divinely created, but also I believe that we're divinely created uniquely, right? We all have different gifts, right? I hope that someone would see me as someone, yes, as a child of God, as carrying this image of God, but also as a Latino, right? Because I have a culture, I have a history, I have a narrative, right? Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah, it makes sense. So let me say this with the understanding of I am not trying to denigrate or belittle someone who says I don't see color, right? But I find that a little hard to believe, because when here's an example. Like, I'll make a reservation at a restaurant, clearly pre-COVID days, right? Mm-hmm. I'll make a reservation at a restaurant and I'll say, hi, I'd like to make a reservation for 4. Great, what's your name? Date. What? Date. How do you spell it? D-E-T-H. Oh, Beth? No, Date. So then I show up to the restaurant and they'll say, well, what is that name? And I was like, I'm Cambodian. Wow. You speak really good English for someone who's Cambodian. So let me unpack it just a little bit, because I've gotten past being angry or put off by this. But part of what I've been in this country since I was 3, right? Mm-hmm. I should speak English really well. Like, I've been trained, I've been groomed. Even though English was my second language, it really operates as my primary language. But inside of that thing, I think part of the message the person is saying is, I see, you don't look like how other folks might look. And my notion of how other folks might look, right? Their English actually is pretty good. You look different than that, and I'm really surprised by your English. And so I'm reminded often, again, I don't have animus about it, but I'm reminded often that folks see me not just as a child of God. They see the difference in me. And to your point, I want them to. I'm proud of being Cambodian. Yeah. part of what it means for me to be made in the image of God is allowing some of my Cambodianness to come through, right? As well as like some of my maleness, as well as like I tend to think I have a lot of flair, some of my flair to come through.
Yeah.
All of that charisma, dynamism, and race. And the more we deny that race is a component of who we are and it affects how we operate in the world, then the more we're kind of denying this really, really important thing. And I just have to say, so let me reverse it, or at least turn it around, turn it around on myself and say, when I walk into a room, right? So I have good friends and I have family members who come to church here. And so one of our traditions is that we spend Christmas Eve here, and it's joyous and it's wonderful. And when I walk into a room, I'm really clear. My first thing that I try and do is just to pick out like how many people of color in the room. And it's not that I do it consciously, like I'm going to count. It's just that I'm aware of who are the people of color in the room. Are there any other folks who identify as Asian or Pacific Islander in the room? That's just one of the things I do. And I don't think I do it as a way of excluding or as a way of putting people off. It's just an awareness that I have. And I think if you don't see it, it speaks to the fact that you haven't had to live your life in which race and ethnicity is a primary lens by which you understand how the world works.
That's a great point. I remember when I was, I've been serving here at Resurrection for 3 years, and I remember when I got here 3 summers ago, I was assigned for our evening services, Saturday and Sunday. So I was, doing my pastoral duties on Saturday evening, and after the service was over, I'm outside greeting folks, and there was this family, a Latino family, that came up to me. She had her 3 boys with her, and she goes, Pastor Tino, and she goes, and I just, said, hey, how you doing? And she goes, tell Pastor Adam thank you. You don't know how, she said this, you don't know how much it feels good to see someone who's a pastor that looks like me and looks like my boys. Right, and I heard that, and I'm just like, wow, that we had this instant connection, right? And I get that, right? Because you're looking for someone in a way. If you are, you're looking for someone that at least looks like you there for that moment, right? Just for some support, just for some comfort, just for And so this is a lot to take in. We understand that growth is it's disciplining your mind, renewing your mind, like Jesus said.
Yeah.
We're talking about how do we counter, right? Because we understand that racism is a barrier for us to live into the beloved community. That being said, we seek to be an anti-racist community. We seek to be an anti-racist church, right? This is a new word that has been, out for at least 2 to 3 years, right? Growing up and going to school, I never heard of this, right? We always said, I'm not a racist, right? Tell us what it means to be an anti-racist community, an anti-racist church. What does that look like? What does that entail?
Yeah. So just here's my disclaimer. I'm clergy, right? I served at Jacob's Well Church, and when you ask clergy a question, I have more than one answer for you. So that's my disclaimer.
No. I hear that.
The first part of what I want to do, particularly because we have spent time looking at history in this session, I just want to understand that when we talk about the term anti-racism, some folks might be like, is just this a newfangled term, or are we just trying to answer the moment? Is this a politically correct thing? I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I want to provide at least a very short historical precedent for why we're talking about anti-racism now. Coming out of the 60s, and the civil rights movement, where we were talking about, like, what does it mean to be more inclusive of folks? We looked at race from a cultural lens, and we created something called cultural competency, right? And so the trainings and the understandings, like, well, let's understand race from the lens of being culturally competent. So you have that, but then what happens is in cultural competency, you still have the norm, which then decides, like, here's the norm, and then we're understanding the other cultures around us, i.e. not white. Then out of cultural competency, then we do a set of trainings around diversity, right? And it's like, let's do diversity training because we want to understand how we are a diverse community. Both are really important and true, but diversity doesn't look at and I'll say it because it theologically, like the sin and the root of racism and just how harmful it is. And then out of diversity, then we started moving into things like implicit bias and explicit bias. And So I'm not saying these aren't important. I'm just talking about kind of the evolution,
evolution of it.
implicit bias. Like there are a set of unconscious decisions that our mind make around race, and we don't even know it, right? And then we started talking about things like understanding race through narratives. Like we have a story to tell, and people of color have a story to tell. And part of what you're hearing right now is that there's a story from communities of color that they need to tell that hasn't been told in kind of the broader narrative of what's going on, right? And so that's why these communities are saying our voices are important. Well, now we're kind of also making this shift to then talk about what you just mentioned, anti-racism. And I think part of why we have gotten to anti-racism and why it's important, it's not just a new word that we're fitting around some old concepts, is the notion of anti-racism is this understanding that it's not enough to not be racist, right? So it could be that you say, I never tell those jokes. It could be that you say, you know what, I don't listen to those stories. It could be that I don't interact negatively. If I see a person of color, I don't do anything that diminishes them. But what that doesn't take into account is, again, structural racism is this understanding that there were a set of laws and a set of history and a set of policies that created what we call an arrangement. What structural racism does is it creates an arrangement that benefits some and then it diminishes others, right? So if that's the arrangement, it's not enough to just say, I'm neutral.
Right.
It's not enough to say, I don't do those things, because if the construct has already been designed, the question is, what are you going to do to undo the construct? So anti-racism is saying that you actually have to do a set of things that undoes the thing that has been done. We are no longer satisfied with neutrality because there really isn't a sense of neutrality here. If you're not going to undo the racism, then you're complicitly advocating and supporting the status quo.
Yeah.
So back to your point. Why is it important to be, for the church to make a commitment and a statement to say that we're an anti-racist church? Part of CORE's mission statement is to be the people of God in this area. And if you're going to be the people of God, that means you're going to support the things that God would support. And that means that you have to undo the constructs that continue to oppress people of color. It means that you actually have to do something definitive. And it means that you're going to do some things that offends a group of folks. Let me make one more connection, if I will, and again, when you say we want to undo how policing has shown up in a structurally racist way in our community, I'm not saying this police officer and that police officer and that police officer is racist. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that there is a way in which police engage communities of color, and what happens as part of the institution and the structures that have existed over time is that it continues to target and make unsafe Black folks. People of color generally, but if we really want to have a very explicit conversation, it's Black folks. Black folks are dying at an alarming rate. And then you want to put into like the whole issue of mass incarceration. That's another conversation. I don't want to get convoluted, but I think the point is, if we're going to be anti-racist, we have to undo this institutional racism that exists within police departments, so that we're not just continuing to engage that police in communities of color, that police are not continuing to engage them in ways in which the end result is you have dead Black folks.
Yeah.
That's and we can. There's another part to that, but let me pause. I need to give you some time.
But I hear that, right? Because with the anti-racism work, right, it it is a constant self-evaluation of, what we are seeing daily, of what we're reading daily, of how we're going to combat, racism in general, right? And so it's kind of like, part of our faith, right? We do self-evaluation, we repent, right? We confess,
Absolutely.
right? With our daily life meditation with God. But even when we're going out being disciples for Jesus, when it comes to this anti-racism work, we're constantly doing that self. We have to be careful. Wait a minute. Do I have these prejudices, these biases, right?
That's right.
Do I need to educate myself? Do I need to listen? Do I need to be more aware? How can I get better to really counter and combat? That's what that anti-racism work is saying, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And if you'll allow me to just continue the analogy
Yeah.
that you just, we need to confess.
Confess.
We need to repent, right? The metanoia that I
Yeah.
know you all have preached around here
Yeah.
is to do a 180, right? But then there's another part of that. Then we have to make restitution, right? So you can change your life. And I firmly believe that there are people here who are wrestling with the issue of racism and they don't have it all figured out, but they've repented. Like they're saying, I don't want to be this way. I don't want to be a part of this. And the question is, what are you going to do to make restitution, to kind of address the situation and then undo what was done? So Jesus' words to Zacchaeus wasn't, come down out of that tree, join me for dinner. It was, go back and restore the evil, the ways that you've stolen from others. You have to go make that right.
Yeah.
And anti-racism is just this notion that what we're going to do is make right the thing that has been wrong for so long.
Right. No longer are we going to be silent anymore.
And you can't be
Right?
silent.
We cannot be silent.
If you're silent, you haven't.
Then, well, that's probably another thing.
I'm on shaky ground.
No,
but if you're
good.
silent,
You're good.
I don't know how you can have a metanoia experience
Yeah.
if you could do a 180 and say, I'm not going to be like that anymore, and be silent.
Yeah.
To me, those two things don't
Yeah.
exist.
No.
Or they don't fit together, I should say.
Amen. Well, so I'm going to give you the final word here. You and I were talking just briefly before this. You said something very powerful. We were talking about Ezekiel 37, right?
Yeah.
The dry bones. We were talking about that. Give us a word of encouragement as we head out.
Yeah, I appreciate you allowing me the chance to say this. Is as I have been doing my own reflecting and reading and meditating on Scripture, the passage that keeps coming up to me is the passage out of Ezekiel 37, the story of the Valley of the Dry Bones. And if you remember the story, it's the prophet finds himself located in this valley of dry bones, and there are bones just littered everywhere. So this isn't like, there's a skull here. Like the whole valley is littered with bones. And God says, do you think these bones could live? And I actually think the way I read it is, it's like, hey, do you have enough faith to believe that these bones will live? And the prophet actually hedges his bets a little bit and was like, only you know, God. I mean, it's the way, if you want them to live. But if you can imagine, if God was asking me and I'm sitting in a room full of bones, like, hey, can these bones live? I'll be like, well, if you make it live, God. But then God says, prophesy to the bones, and then they will have life. And then the prophet actually then, out of step of faith, just prophesies and says, bones live. And part of what comes up to the passage says that there's this huge rattling. If you can imagine bones that were dead and dry, right? They find life, and bone connects to bone and skin over bone, and it makes this huge sound, and they come together. And there's the second thing, which is like, but they aren't filled with breath. So there is this way in which the skeleton of our bodies come together and the bones join, but then we don't have the breath, the Spirit of God in us, animating us. And it's like, prophesy. And then in verse 9 of chapter 37, the prophet prophesies, and the prophet says, I give you the breath from the four corners of the earth, the winds from the four corners of the earth. Which to me actually speaks of the fact that this breath comes from everywhere in every direction. And back in those times, like that would have been their way of understanding, like, we can be together. So these bones that are littered, they don't have breath until the winds from the four corners, the winds from every part of the earth, from the peoples of every part of the earth, God calls that wind and breathes life into these bones. And that's when they begin to live again. engaging in the issue of racism puts us in a valley of dry bones. And it's littered with all kinds of death. And it's hard work. And as we've seen, for a lot of folks, it has meant the sacrifice of their lives. But more than that, it's been the valley of the dry bones. It's like things are so dry and broken that our spirit is crushed and we feel like there's no way forward. And I feel like what God is saying to the church right now is, "Oh, prophet, can these bones live? Can the people who are no longer, who are just beyond, they don't have any more hope, can we live?" And the question for us as people of God is our response going to be, "Only you know, God"? And then if our response is like, "Only you know," and then God says, "Well, prophesy," then the question is, will we step into the valley of the dry bones and will we prophesy, not just sit and listen, not just sit back and let God breathe life. It took the prophet prophesying the words of God. It takes the people of God doing a thing that will breathe life into us. And that thing is a commitment to anti-racism and supporting a set of policies and practices that will breathe new life into us. And then just the final thing I'll say is, in that scripture, I was really surprised when I read it this morning. It said, "Breathe life into the bodies that were slain." Not the bodies that were dead, but the bodies that were slain. And I wonder if the challenge God is making to us is, can the church prophesy a word of anti-racism into the dead bodies that are slain, that are asking us to look at, like, what is dead and can new life come out of that? Only if we're willing to speak the good news of anti-racism that says there are a set of practices that must happen. And can we get off of the sidelines and can we walk through that valley? And then when that breath comes in from all the corners of the earth, that we are a part of this renewed people together.
Amen. You know, I picture you having a mic just now and then just mic drop. Right?
Thank you.
Hey,
Thank
brother,
you.
thank you for joining with us tonight. And the conversation continues.
Absolutely.
Right? Absolutely. God bless you, Deth. Thank you for being with us.
Thank
Much
you.
love, brother.
Blessings.